Fall 1971. A dark field stretches beneath a gray Wisconsin sky. 6 acres of Vernon County loam buried under 40 tons of crooked carrots no cannery would touch. Wind cuts down from the ridge sharp enough to bite through canvas. The camera pulls back. A weathered auction tent rises at the field's edge. 40 people huddle around a flatbed platform, breath visible in the cold light. A low murmur passes through the crowd when a number gets called out. $60. Not a single hand comes up against it. Close now. A gloved hand lifts a bidder's card. A woman in an oversized canvas coat hair pulled back with baling twine. 31 years old. A widow. Nobody in that tent knows she has been running the arithmetic for 3 months. At the back, a man in a wool sport coat stands still, eyes narrowing. A green Buick Electra idles on the shoulder beyond the fence. The gavel comes down. The auction tent at the Holdridge place sat in the flat yellow light of an October afternoon that couldn't decide whether to hold on to summer or let it go. Vernon County, Wisconsin, 1971. The kind of day when the wind came off the ridge with just enough edge to remind a person that winter was already loading its wagons somewhere north of Eau Claire. There were maybe 40 people standing on the trampled grass between the machine shed and the equipment row. Most of them men in Carhartt jackets and seed corn caps, a few women in wool coats holding coffee that had gone lukewarm 2 lots ago. The auctioneer's platform was a flatbed trailer with a hand-lettered sign nailed to the tongue. Kraus Auction Service. Wendell Kraus himself stood on the flatbed with a wireless microphone that squealed when he turned his head too fast. Maribel Thorson stood near the back edge of the crowd, close enough to the rear tire of a parked Massey Ferguson that she could rest one gloved hand on the tread when the bidding got slow. She was 31 years old. She wore a canvas barn coat that had belonged to her father Cuffs, turned twice because his arms had been longer than hers. Her hair was the color of unfinished oak pulled back at the nape with a piece of baling twine because she'd forgotten to grab a proper tie before she left the house. In the inside pocket of the coat against her ribs was a green composition notebook with a soft spine and a rubber band around it. Everyone in the crowd knew who she was. Not one of them was watching her. Wendell Kraus worked through the tractor first, then the hay rake, then the disc harrow with the bent tooth on the third gang. He worked through a lot of hand tools that went for pocket change and a chest freezer that went to the Rasmussen boys for $11 because they wanted the compressor for a walk-in cooler they were building behind their father's meat market. The sun moved a full hand's width across the sky between the tractor and the last real piece of equipment. By the time Wendell got to lot 47, the crowd had thinned to about half of what it had been at the start, and the people who remained were the kind who came to farm auctions because farm auctions were where the county did its arithmetic in public. Wendell held up a piece of paper and cleared his throat into the microphone. The static cut sideways across his voice for a second before it settled. His words came out flat the way a man talks when he's decided in advance to move something quickly and not dwell on what he's asking people to bid on. The lot was gross. 47 wooden produce crates, most warped, some with slat gaps a person could push a fist through. One hand-cranked root washer, single drum, 40 inches long, with a 4-inch crack running along the weld seam and brush rollers worn down to the steel cores. And the standing right to haul away whatever carrots remained in the back 6 acres of the Holdridge place, which the crowd already knew about because everyone in Vernon County had heard the story by mid-August. The Vernon County Cannery had rejected the entire Holdridge fall harvest. Too crooked, too forked, too knobby to run through the commercial peeler without jamming the blade guides every 40 seconds. 40 tons of carrots sitting in 6 acres of black loam, and the Holdridges couldn't sell them for the cost of pulling them out of the ground. Wendell opened at $10. Nobody moved. He came down to $5. A man near the front laughed under his breath, the kind of laugh that carried because it was meant to carry. Maribel raised her gloved hand. $60. The number landed in the tent like a stone dropped into a horse trough. Not loud, just wrong size for the container. Wendell looked at her from the flatbed with an expression that hovered between confusion and mild concern, the way a man looks at a friend who has just misread the menu at a diner. He asked once low whether she meant 6. She shook her head. 60. Wendell paused a beat longer than he needed to. He looked around the tent to see if anybody wanted to argue with her. Nobody did. The man near the front who had laughed under his breath was now looking at his boots. Wendell brought the gavel down and said her name into the microphone, and the sound of Maribel Thorson going home with the Holdridge lot moved through the crowd like weather. She didn't stay for the closeout. She walked to her truck, which was a 1963 Ford F-100 with a dented left rear panel and 140,000 miles on the odometer. And she was pulling her checkbook out of the glove box when her brother-in-law, Harlan Thorson, found her. Harlan was 35, a soft-spoken man with hands that had never once been clean in the 22 years Maribel had known him. He farmed 160 acres 2 miles east of her place and had a wife and 3 children and a habit of showing up whenever Maribel appeared to need a second pair of hands without ever quite saying that was why he was there. He stood beside the truck with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. He wanted to know what she was planning to do with 40 tons of carrots that a commercial cannery had already told her she couldn't sell. Maribel closed the checkbook and put it on the dashboard. She wasn't planning to sell them to the cannery. Harlan waited. That was fine, he said. But what was she planning to do with them? She was planning to feed them to horses. Harlan looked at her, then at the 6 acres visible beyond the machine shed, then at the F-100 with its dented panel and its tired suspension. He didn't laugh. His face did something quieter than laughter, a small settling of the features that acknowledged the situation as it stood without passing judgment on it. He said she was going to need a bigger truck. She said she knew that. She asked if he could help her borrow one. He could. He did. And that was the last time Harlan Thorson appeared in her story as anything resembling a skeptic. She might have driven straight home. Instead, she pulled onto the shoulder half a mile down the county road and sat with the engine idling and watched the light change across the ridge. The cannery decision was 3 weeks old at that point. The Holdridges had spent those 3 weeks trying to sell the crop to anyone who would take it and had failed at every door. The 40 tons had already been written off in 3 separate ledgers, including the cannery's, before Wendell Krause had ever printed the lot number on his tag. She was the 4th person to hold a claim on those carrots, and she was the first who intended to do anything other than plow them under. She was still sitting there when a green Buick Electra slowed on the shoulder ahead of her and pulled a U-turn to come back the other way. The car eased alongside her window. The man behind the wheel was somewhere north of 45, wearing a wool sport coat over a cannery uniform shirt with the name stitched above the pocket. Merle Blackwood, head of purchasing, Vernon County Cannery. He had been standing at the back of the auction tent for the entire Lot 47 sale, and Maribel had not noticed him because she had been counting money in her head. He rolled down the passenger window and rested his elbow on the sill. He asked whether she'd bought the Holdridge carrots. She said she had. He smiled, the small, careful smile of a man who was about to be helpful in a way that cost him nothing. He wanted her to understand something. The cannery had already run those carrots through the sample line. He'd been there for the run. The carrots weren't just cosmetically irregular. The soil out there had a mineral profile that produced a woody core in about 15% of the crop. He was telling her this as a courtesy. He didn't want to see a young widow lose a bigger check than the $60 she'd already spent. Maribel looked at him for what felt to Merle like a longer moment than it actually was. She thanked him for the courtesy. She said she'd keep it in mind. He nodded. He rolled the window back up. The Buick pulled onto the road and disappeared around the bend toward town. She waited until the sound of the engine was gone before she wrote 3 lines in the green notebook. Merle Blackwood, sport coat, warned about woody core unsolicited. Below that, check with Francis Ree mineral profile claim. Below that, never met a man who volunteered a warning without a reason. She closed the notebook. She put the truck in gear. She drove home to a farmhouse that had been paid for since 1954, and a shop that had been standing since 1946, and a father's ledger that had been keeping her family honest for 40 years running. Her name was Maribel Alma Thorson. Everyone who had known her longer than a decade called her Mari. She had been born in the front bedroom of the Mays farmhouse on a March morning in 1940, the second of Raymond and Alma May's 4 children, and the only one of them who ever showed any interest in the animals her father kept, for reasons that had nothing to do with money. Raymond ran 60 head of Hereford cattle on 280 acres of hilly ground outside Viroqua that was better suited to grazing than to row crops. He understood this about his land the way a man understands something he did not choose, but has made his peace with over the course of many quiet mornings. Raymond was not a romantic about farming. He was a bookkeeper about farming. He kept a ledger in a green composition notebook that he bought 3 at a time from the hardware store in town, and he entered every dollar in and every dollar out in a handwriting so small and precise, it looked as though someone had said it in type. He taught Mari to keep the ledger when she was 9 years old. Not because she asked, because she was the one who sat down at the kitchen table without being told to. He said the ledger told a person the truth about their operation. He said most people preferred not to know the truth about their operation. He said that preference was the reason most people eventually lost their operations. Raymond kept 4 horses in the years Mari was growing up. 2 were Belgian drafts named Albert and Clarence that he used for skidding logs out of the woodlot and for moving hay bales through the low fields where the tractor sank past its hubs in spring. The other 2 were a mare named Pepper and a foal Mari named Biscuit when she was 11. She broke Biscuit to saddle at 13, working from a library book, and her own patient observation of how Pepper moved when she was comfortable and how she moved when she wasn't. Raymond watched from the fence rail without interfering. He told Alma that Mari had a feel for it. Alma said she knew. He said it was unusual. Alma said she knew that too. Mari finished high school in Viroqua in 1958 with a scholarship offer from the University of Wisconsin in Madison for a teaching program. She had a suitcase. She had a bus ticket. She had a housing assignment and a letter with a list of what to bring. She did not go. This is not a story about why she did not go because Mari never explained it in terms that invited analysis. What she said when people asked was that the farm needed her that year, then the next year, then the years after that, and at some point the question stopped being relevant. What she did not say was that Raymond's health had begun to slip in the fall of 1957. What the ledger showed, if a person cared to read it, was that by 1959, Raymond could not reliably get through a full day of field work without stopping to sit on the tailgate of the truck for 20 minutes at a stretch. She ran the cattle operation alongside her father through the early 1960s. She ran it beside him and increasingly for him through the middle of the decade. Raymond died in the winter of 1967 at the age of 62, leaving Mari the farm, the equipment, the ledger system, the horses, and a savings account at the Viroqua State Bank with $14,200 in it. The farm had no mortgage. Raymond had paid it off in 1954. He told her the winter before he died that a paid-for farm was the only thing a bank could not take from a person. He said everything else in agriculture was just borrowing time. She wrote that in the ledger the same afternoon. She had married Carl Thorson in 1964. Carl farmed his family's ground 2 miles north. He was a capable, steady man with no particular gift for horses, but a deep respect for Mari's. He was quiet without being cold. He read agricultural bulletins the way other men read the sports page. He drank 1 beer on Saturday nights and no beer any other night of the week. Mari loved him in the particular way a person loves someone whose presence makes the ordinary bearable. He died of a heart attack in his own alfalfa field in the summer of 1969 at 33, with the sun still high enough to burn the back of his neck where his hat had fallen off. He was found by his cousin at 4 in the afternoon. Mari was called at 4:20. She drove to the field herself in the F-100 and sat with him in the grass for an hour before she let anyone else come near. By the fall of 1971, Mari Thorson had been farming 410 combined acres alone for 2 years. She had $19,400 in the bank. She had no debt. She had the ledger. And she had on a Tuesday afternoon in October spent $60 at auction on a lot that no one else in the county considered worth the price of the paperwork. The morning after the auction, she drove to the co-op in Viroqua to pick up a bag of chicken feed and a length of hydraulic hose for the manure spreader. She parked the F-100 in the gravel lot next to Elton Feed and Supply. The bell over the door still rang the way it had rung when her father had come in for 10-penny nails in 1953. She pushed through and into the warm smell of grain dust and diesel and cracked corn. 6 men were standing around the coffee pot at the back. Merle Blackwood was one of them. He had a paper cup in one hand, and the other hand rested on the shoulder of a man Mari recognized as Dale Kettner, who farmed 600 acres 3 miles east and had a reputation for laughing at other people's ideas before he had finished hearing them. Merle saw her come in. He straightened without straightening, that small adjustment a certain kind of man makes when he has decided to perform for the room. He raised his voice by half a step. He was in the middle of a story. He wanted her to catch the ending. The way he told it, some widow had bought 40 tons of Cannery reject carrots at the Holdridge sale for $60, and the punchline was that maybe she thought the carrots would straighten themselves out if she prayed hard enough. Dale Kettner laughed too loud. 2 other men laughed the way men laugh when they are not sure whether they should. The other 3 did not laugh at all. Mari walked to the counter. She asked Ronnie behind the register for her hose and her chicken feed. She paid in cash. She counted the change. She turned toward the door. On the way past the coffee circle, she took the green notebook out of her coat pocket, opened it to the page where she had written Merle's name the night before, and added a single line beneath it. She did not look at Merle while she wrote. She did not look at Dale Kettner. She wrote. She closed the notebook. She walked out to the truck. The bell over the door rang behind her. The wind coming off the ridge had picked up since the auction. It was cold enough now that she pulled her collar to her chin as she loaded the feed sack into the truck bed. What she had written in the notebook was 3 words. Man is worried. She would not have said it that way out loud. She was not in the habit of narrating other people's fears back to them. But $60 was not the kind of number that got a purchasing manager out of a cannery office on his lunch hour to warn a widow about mineral profiles on a shoulder half a mile from the auction tent. And it was not the kind of number that inspired stories at the co-op the next morning either. $60 was in the ordinary run of things exactly the amount of money the county was accustomed to Mari Thorson spending. It was what she paid for a good used chainsaw. It was what she paid to have Biscuit's teeth floated. It was what the county expected of her, and no more. What the county did not know, and what Merle Blackwood was beginning to suspect for reasons he had not yet examined, was that Mari had spent the last 3 months walking every back road in Vernon County, looking at what was being written off. And that she had been running the arithmetic on those write-offs at the kitchen table every night after supper in the same green notebooks Raymond had bought 3 at a time. And that the $60 bid at the Holdridge sale had not been an impulse. It had been the last step of a calculation that had begun in a boarding stable outside La Crosse in the middle of August. The stable was called Cedar Bluff, and it sat on 80 acres of mixed pasture and hardwood, 40 minutes northwest of Viroqua, on a road that turned to gravel a mile before you got there. Mari had driven up on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of the month with a thermos of coffee and a sheet of questions written on the back of a feed invoice. Frances Oberlin was expecting her. Frances was 47 that summer. She had been boarding horses for 20 years, had come to it after a first marriage that ended badly, and a second husband who was still around and had the good sense to stay out of the horse business. She wore a canvas coat similar to Mari's and had short gray hair she cut herself with kitchen shears every 8 weeks. Frances had never met Mari before that afternoon. She had heard about her from a farrier who worked both operations. They sat at Frances's kitchen table for the better part of 3 hours. Frances answered every question Mari had and volunteered a dozen more Mari had not thought to ask. She talked about what horses ate in winter, what it cost, and what they would eat that was not hay. She said horses would take root vegetables through the cold months as a supplement to their dry ration, that carrots and beets and turnips broke the monotony of hay and helped a horse hold condition through January when the wind came out of the northwest for 11 days running. She said horses on root supplements came through winter in better shape than horses on hay alone. She said the only problem with feeding roots at any real scale was that produce suppliers charged retail prices for what was at bottom a field crop. Mari asked what price would make sense. Frances told her. Frances told her, in fact, that she had been trying to source bulk carrots for 6 years and had never been able to find anyone willing to sell them at a number that penciled out. Mari drove home that evening with the invoice sheet in her lap and did the arithmetic in the green notebook at the kitchen table before she took her coat off. The arithmetic was clean. The arithmetic was the kind that made her hands still on the page when she saw where it ended. She spent the next 6 weeks driving, not conspicuously, not in any way that would have drawn a comment from the neighbors. She drove the back roads on Sunday afternoons and after supper on the long light evenings, and she looked at fields the way her father had looked at cattle. She saw a bean field near Westby that was going to yield well, but was already spoken for by a co-op contract. She saw a cornfield outside Coon Valley that had been hailed to ribbons in July. She saw an onion crop near Chaseburg that was going to make the grower a good year. She saw the Holdridge back 6 from the county road on a Tuesday evening in late September. She got out of the truck. She walked into the rows. She pulled up 3 carrots. The first one was crooked. The second was forked in the specific way carrots forked when they grew into a stone. The third had wrapped itself around a piece of buried gravel and come out of the soil in a shape that would have jammed a commercial peeler in under 5 seconds. She bit the end off the third one and stood there in the dust chewing it. It tasted the way a carrot tasted. It tasted, in fact, better than the carrots she was used to buying at the grocery store in Viroqua because it had been pulled from ground 20 minutes ago rather than shipped from California in a refrigerated truck. She spit the greens onto the row. She walked back to the F-100. She drove home. That was 3 weeks before the auction. She wrote in the green notebook that night Holdridge carrots. Sound, sweet, no woody core in the three sampled. Cannery reject is cosmetic. Francis price minus my delivery cost, minus washing, minus bagging, minus cold storage equals margin sufficient to feed 16 horses through winter with surplus to sell. Continue calculation. She continued the calculation for another 2 weeks. By the morning of the auction, the calculation was complete. She did not need to bid against anyone at $60 because she knew what $60 represented. It represented the exact price at which a plan she had been building since August became a piece of ground she could walk onto. The shop behind the farmhouse had been built by Raymond in 1946, the year after he came home from the Pacific. He had poured the concrete himself and set the tin roof over the summer of that first year, working weekends between hay cuttings. It was 40 feet by 24. It had a wood stove in the northwest corner with a length of stovepipe that ran through the roof at an angle Raymond had cut precisely to clear the ridge cap. Along the south wall was a workbench Raymond had built in 1948 from 2-inch oak planks he had rough sawn from a windfall in the woodlot and dried underweight in the loft above the machine shed. The bench was 6 feet deep and 18 feet long. It had held every tool Raymond had ever owned, and now it held every tool Mari had inherited. There was a cutting torch he had bought used from a pipeline crew in 1951 for $18. There was a Lincoln arc welder he had traded a spring calf for in 1955. There was a bench grinder, a drill press, a bench vise from the Ludwig factory in Fond du Lac, and a set of taps and dies in a wooden case with a broken hinge Mari had fixed with a strip of leather and 2 tacks when she was 14. The cutting oil in the torch reservoir was the same cutting oil Raymond had poured in the last time he had used the torch, which was the winter before he died. Marie had checked the level once in the 4 years since. It was fine. On the afternoon of the day after Wendell Krause dropped the gavel at $60, Harlan pulled his neighbor's flatbed truck into the shop yard with the root washer strapped to the deck. He and Mari unloaded it onto the shop floor with a come-along and 2 hardwood planks laid at an angle from the deck to the concrete. Harlan looked at the crack in the drum. He looked at the brush rollers worn down to the steel. He looked at the crankshaft which turned but rattled. He said nothing. Harlan had learned to say nothing about things Mari intended to fix, because he had learned that saying nothing was usually the more useful contribution. He drove home in the flatbed. Mari lit the wood stove and let the shop come up to temperature. She sat on a milking stool in front of the washer for the better part of an hour before she touched it. Raymond had taught her that. Look at a broken thing long enough to know why it broke before you decide how to fix it. The crack in the drum was 4 inches along the weld seam opening at one end, where the sheet metal had begun to flex under load. She could see the fatigue marks in the steel. The brush rollers were shot, but the cores were sound, which meant she could rebuild them with new bristle material rather than replace them entirely. The crank mechanism was intact and would turn smoothly once she pulled it apart and oiled the shaft bearings, which had gone dry over what looked like 3 or 4 seasons of neglect. The frame was straight. The output chute was too narrow for a 50-pound feed bag, but could be modified. The drum seal had failed and was going to need to be fabricated from scratch. She welded the drum crack that first evening with the Lincoln and a rod she found in a coffee can on the shelf above the welder. The coffee can had been on the shelf for at least 11 years. The rod was fine. Steel did not know how to age when it was kept dry. She ground the beads smooth with a wheel she mounted to the bench grinder. She wire brushed the seam and looked at her work under the drop light. It was clean. Raymond would have said it was clean. That was the highest form of praise Raymond had ever offered on any subject. The following Tuesday, she drove to a farm supply in La Crosse and found brush stock in a bin near the back of the store. Stiff nylon bristle material used for grain elevator cleaning equipment. She bought enough to repack 4 rollers at a cost of $11 for the material. The drum seal she fabricated from a strip of conveyor belting she found folded under the workbench so old it had taken on the shape of the floor. She cut it to width with Raymond's tin snips, punched the bolt holes with the drill press, and had it fitted in under 40 minutes. The output chute she rebuilt from a piece of 18-gauge sheet steel she found in the corner of the shop, left over from a repair Raymond had done on a grain bin sometime in the mid-60s. She bent the new chute over the edge of the workbench with a rubber mallet and a piece of angle iron for a form. She welded it to the output housing at an angle that directed cleaned carrots into the mouth of a 50-pound burlap bag without her needing to hold the bag and turn the crank at the same time. Total cost of the rebuild, including the $60 for the lot 11 for the brush stock, 4 for welding rod, and 2 for hardware, $77. She wrote every number in the ledger that night. Below the numbers, she added in her father's small, precise hand, commercial equivalent unit priced at farm supply, $400 minimum, requires PTO connection. Not applicable to this operation. Frances called on the last Wednesday in October. She wanted to know how it was coming. Mari told her the washer was rebuilt and the carrots would begin coming out of the ground the following Saturday. Frances asked whether Mari had run into any trouble with anyone. There was a pause on the line. Mari understood what she was being asked. Frances went on. 3 horse operations in the La Crosse area had been contacted over the past 4 days by a man from the Vernon County Cannery. The man had told them in tones ranging from concerned to insistent that the Holdridge carrots carried a risk of soil-borne pathogens because of an issue with the drainage on that particular field. 2 of the operations had called Frances to confirm. Frances had told them what she thought of the claim. She was calling now because she wanted Mari to know. Mari's hand tightened on the receiver. She did not raise her voice. "I appreciate the call, Frances." Frances went on. She thought Mari should come up to Cedar Bluff. Bring a couple of carrots. Let her people see for themselves. Word traveled in the horse community. It was better to travel with it than behind it. Mari drove up the next morning with 2 of the Holdridge carrots in a paper sack on the seat beside her. She had pulled them the previous Saturday and rinsed the dirt off in the shop sink. They were both crooked. One was forked. Both were sound. Frances met her at the barn office. She had asked 2 women to be their boarders from operations in Onalaska and West Salem who had been in the phone tree of nervousness Merle Blackwood had set up. Mari shook their hands. She set the carrots on Frances's desk. She took a paring knife from her coat pocket and sliced the forked one lengthwise. The flesh inside was uniform orange dense. No woody core, no dark ring at the pith. She cut a piece off and put it in her mouth and chewed it. She cut a second piece and offered it to the woman from Onalaska, who took it and chewed it and looked at Frances and shrugged in a way that meant the carrot tasted like a carrot. Mari did not make a speech. "The soil out there is Fayette silt loam. I checked the county survey at the extension office. It drains fine. There is no pathogen concern. The carrots are irregular because the soil is stony in that back 6. That is a shape problem for a peeling line. It is not a health problem for a horse. If you want a veterinary reference, I will get you one. If you want a bag to try, I will bring you a bag next week at no cost. If your horses do not eat them, or if you see any issue at all, I will take the bag back and refund your delivery fee, which I have not yet collected." The woman from West Salem asked what Mari's price was. Mari told her. The woman did the arithmetic in her head and looked at Frances with an expression that meant she had already decided. The woman from Onalaska asked whether the delivery schedule was going to be reliable. Mari said the delivery schedule was going to be as reliable as her truck, which was as reliable as anything else on her farm, which was to say that it was going to be there when she said it would be there. Frances stood up from her desk. She said the 200 bag order she had placed the week before was standing. She said she would take another 50 on top of it as soon as Mari could bag them. Mari drove home that afternoon with the paper sack empty on the seat and the arithmetic doing quiet patient work in her chest. Not triumph, not vindication, something older than either. The plain ordinary sensation of a plan holding together at the point of first pressure. She pulled the Holdridge carrots the first weekend in November, working the back 6 over 3 long days with a borrowed 2-row digger behind the F100. The ground was soft from a heavy October rain. The carrots lifted cleanly. She ran them through the rebuilt washer in the shop in evening shifts, 2 hours after supper. Each night, the wood stove ticking and the crank turning under her hand, the clean carrots dropping into 50-pound burlap bags at 60 cents apiece from the feed store stacked 3 deep on pallets along the north wall. The root cellar under the farmhouse held 400 bags. Raymond had poured the walls and floor in 1946 with a ventilation shaft that kept the temperature between 34 and 40 degrees through the coldest Vernon County winters without any mechanical assistance. Mari filled the cellar in the second week. She rented cold storage at the Viroqua grain elevator for the remainder at $40 for the season. Total cost of the operation entered in the ledger in the small, precise hand that had begun to look more and more like Raymond's 60 for the lot 11 for brush stock, 4 for rod, 2 for hardware, 108 for bagging, 40 for cold storage, 22 for fuel across 7 trips to La Crosse and back. $247. She delivered the first 200 bags to Cedar Bluff on the 11th of November in the borrowed flatbed. Francis wrote her a check for $300. She delivered the additional 50 on the 18th. She delivered 50 more to the Unalaska operation on the 22nd and another 75 to West Salem on the 25th. By the 1st of December, she had sold nearly half of the 40 tons and had covered every dollar of her cost with the first 4 checks. The Sunday after the West Salem delivery, she stopped for gas at the Sinclair station outside Viroqua on the way home. She was standing at the pump with the nozzle in the F-100's filler when a Buick Electra pulled in behind her at the second pump. Merle Blackwood got out of the driver's side. He walked around the front of his car and past the pump island and stopped at a distance from her that was calculated not to feel like an approach. He asked how she was doing. She said she was doing fine. He said he had heard she was moving product. She said she was moving product. He said he had heard she was going to have inventory left over come January. She said she probably would. He said if she found herself in a bind for a buyer, the cannery had a livestock feed contract with a rendering operation up near Eau Claire. He could put her in touch. It would not be top dollar, but it would be a check. Mari clicked the nozzle off. She hung it back on the pump. She screwed the cap on her filler. She looked at Merle for a moment. The wind coming off the ridge had turned cold enough now that her breath was visible when she spoke. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Blackwood. I will let you know." She got in the truck. She drove home. The green notebook came out of her coat before she took the coat off. She wrote 3 lines. Merle Blackwood Sinclair Station. Offered livestock feed buyer at reduced price. Wants inventory off the market before January. Below that, in slightly larger letters than she usually used, she wrote a single sentence. A man makes 3 moves in 2 months. He is not warning you. He is watching the clock. She closed the notebook. She hung her coat on the peg by the back door. She lit the wood stove in the kitchen and set water on for coffee. Outside, past the shop and the machine shed, and the empty back pasture where Biscuit's granddaughter grazed in a coat of early winter fuzz, the sun was going down over the ridge in the specific slow way it went down in Vernon County in early December. Half of the 40 tons was already gone. The remainder was in storage cold and dry and paid for. Francis had already asked what Mari planned to do about sourcing next fall. 2 operations Mari had never met before November had put their names on her delivery list for the coming month. The ledger showed a net position before the last 3 deliveries were priced out of a little over $1,800 in the black on a bid of $60. Mari poured the coffee. She sat down at the kitchen table. She opened the ledger to a new page and began the calculation for the second year, because the second year was where the real work was going to start, and because she had a purchasing manager at the county's largest cannery who had already watched her long enough to make 3 separate moves without knowing that she had been keeping count. Somewhere past the shop, a coyote called once from the ridge. She wrote through the sound. She wrote until the coffee went cold in the cup and the kitchen had grown dark enough around her that the only light in the room was the small yellow circle of the lamp on the table and the red glow of the wood stove door. She wrote until the second-year plan had a shape she could see. Then she closed the notebook, put the rubber band back around it, and slid it into the inside pocket of the barn coat, hanging on the peg by the door where it would be ready the next morning, when the truck started and the day began again. The check from Francis Oberlin cleared the Viroqua State Bank on the 7th of December, 1971. Mari did not celebrate. She drove into town on the 8th, deposited it, and asked the teller for a printed statement showing the balance. She folded the statement into thirds and put it inside the ledger next to the entry for the Holdridge lot. Then she drove home and began the second-year plan in earnest. The second-year plan was not about carrots. Carrots had been the proof of concept. What Mari understood sitting at the kitchen table on the 9th of December with the wood stove going and the wind pushing sleet against the north window was that Vernon County produced in an average year somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 tons of rejected root vegetables that the canneries either plowed under or sold to renderers for pennies on the ton. The rejection was not a bug in the system. It was a feature of it. Commercial peelers required uniformity. Uniformity was a narrow band. Anything outside that band became someone else's problem. Or if a person had done the arithmetic, Mari had done someone else's opportunity. She wrote to 2 cannery operations that week. One was in Crawford County, 30 miles south. The other was in Monroe County, 20 miles west. She did not write to the Vernon County Cannery. She did not need to. She wrote instead to purchasing managers she had never met at operations she had only driven past, and she said in each letter the same thing. She was in the market for cosmetically rejected root vegetables, specifically carrots, beets, turnips, and rutabagas taken in whole load lots, at the point of rejection paid in cash on delivery at a price she named. She was writing to establish a standing arrangement so that when a load was pulled from their processing line, for cosmetic reasons they could call her before they called the renderer. She included her telephone number. She included Francis Oberlin's telephone number as a reference. She signed each letter M. A. Thorson and addressed the envelopes to whoever currently held the purchasing job. Both letters were answered inside 2 weeks. The Crawford County manager, a man named Everett Landgren, whose father had known Raymond in the 40s, called first. He said he did not know they had a market for the reject loads beyond the renderer, and he was pleased to hear otherwise. He said his line pulled roughly 2 loads a month during the fall run, and he would call her the next time it happened. The Monroe County manager wrote back with a formal letter agreeing to the arrangement and asking whether she would consider taking their beet calls as well. She wrote back the same afternoon and said yes. By the end of January, she had a network. It was small, it was quiet, it did not appear in any farm publication, did not travel on any rural route grapevine, and did not require any capital beyond gasoline money and the checkbook she carried in the F-100's glove box. Between the Holdridge stockpile in her cellar and the standing arrangements with Crawford and Monroe, she had winter feed lined up for 18 months of horse operations she did not yet own. The horses came in the spring of 1972. She sold 20 head of Hereford cattle in April at Withrow's sale barn in Sparta and used the proceeds minus the trailer fee to buy 3 mares at a dispersal sale in Crawford County the following weekend. The dispersal was for an estate. The owner had died in February and his widow was closing out the operation. Mari watched the mares move through a small paddock behind the barn for the better part of an hour before she made a single bid. 2 were bay quarter horse crosses in their prime 6 and 7 years old with clean legs and the kind of walk that told her they would settle into work without protest. The third was an older sorrel, 13 past her breeding years, but sound calm and by the look of her willing. Mari bought all 3 for $600 combined. She hauled them home in her neighbor Vernon Kittleson's stock trailer that evening. The bay named Juno was in foal. Mari had known that when she bought her. The widow had not mentioned it either because she did not know or because she had assumed the buyer would notice which Mari had. That was 2 horses for the price of 1. It was the sort of arithmetic Raymond would have approved of, done quietly in the head in the moment. Through the spring and summer, Mari sold the remaining Herefords in small batches at 3 separate sale barns to avoid depressing the local price. She kept 10 cows and their calves for beef and for the land management they provided on the steeper slopes where the horses would not thrive. The rest of the pasture she reconfigured for the horse operation, running new fence along the North 40. In a pattern that separated the mares from the geldings, gave her a smaller foaling paddock adjacent to the main barn, and left a 2-acre round pen area where she could work young stock without dragging equipment across the fields every session. Juno foaled in late April. The foal was a filly dark bay with a small white star and legs that came up under her at the right angles the first time she stood. Mari named her Ardith after her mother's aunt, a woman who had run a dairy operation outside Sparta in the 1920s without a husband, and had done well enough at it to leave the farm to a niece rather than to the county. The name did not make it into any registry papers because the filly was not registered. Mari kept the papers on Juno in the ledger with everything else, and did not concern herself with formal breeding documents. What she was building was not a papered operation. It was a working horse operation for people who wanted animals that could be ridden and worked without a fight. The market for that, as she was beginning to understand, was substantially larger and substantially more forgiving than the papered market. Frances came down from Cedar Bluff in June to look at what Mari was doing. She stood at the fence line for 20 minutes watching Ardith move through the small paddock with her mother, and then she walked the full length of the north pasture with Mari without saying much of anything. At the end of the walk, she stopped by the F-100 and looked at Mari with the expression of a woman who had come to a conclusion she was not going to soften. You are going to have a waiting list inside 4 years. You do not need to advertise. You need to keep doing exactly what you are doing and let the word find you. Mari accepted the assessment the way she accepted most things people told her. She wrote it in the ledger that night verbatim as a hypothesis to be tested rather than a prediction to be believed. By the fall of 1975, she had 7 horses of her own and had sold 4 foals to buyers in Wisconsin and Minnesota, 3 of them to people who had come to her through Frances, and 1 to a family in Winona County who had heard about her from a farrier who traveled the region. Every sale had been to a working home. Every animal had left her farm halter broken, standing for a farrier loading in a trailer without protest, and in the case of the 3-year-olds, started under saddle by Mireille herself in the round pen behind the shop. By the spring of 1977, she had 12 horses and had begun keeping a written list of people who had asked about future foals. The list started with 8 names. By August, it was 14. She did not call it a waiting list. She called it a folder. She kept it in the ledger on a page marked simply names. The trouble came in April of 1978. It came on a Tuesday morning in the form of a state agriculture inspector's car pulling up her drive at 9:15, with the dew still visible on the north side of the barn roof. Mari was in the barn wrapping a hoof abscess on the older sorrel whose name was Delphine, and who tolerated the treatment because she had known Marie for 6 years. Marie heard the car before she saw it. She heard the specific sound a state car made on gravel, which was different from the sound a neighbor's truck made, or a delivery van, or her brother's station wagon. It was the sound of a vehicle whose driver had no reason to hurry and no reason to hesitate. She finished wrapping Delphine's hoof set, the poultice pan on the tackroom shelf, wiped her hands on a rag, and walked out into the yard. The man who got out of the car was in his early 50s, wearing a suit under a windbreaker and carrying a clipboard in a small leather case. He introduced himself as Thaddeus Ellsworth from the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Livestock Health Division, out of the regional office in Eau Claire. He said his office had received a formal complaint alleging that Mari was feeding contaminated cull produce to her horses in unsanitary storage conditions, and that this practice was suspected to be causing intermittent illness in the herd. He said the complaint had been anonymous. He said his office had a statutory obligation to investigate any complaint alleging animal welfare concerns, regardless of source. He said he was sorry to be arriving without notice, but that surprise inspections were also a matter of statute. Mari looked at him for a long moment. She did not raise her voice. She did not offer him coffee. She said only that he was welcome to see anything he wanted to see, that she would walk him through the operation in the order he preferred, and that she had records available for whatever period he wished to review. Thaddeus Ellsworth had inspected 63 livestock operations in the previous 12 months. He had a routine. He asked to see the feed storage first. Mari walked him to the root cellar under the farmhouse, opened the outside bulkhead door, and led him down the 6 concrete steps into the cold, dry space that Raymond had built the year after the war. Thaddeus stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom. He looked at the ventilation shaft cut through the north wall. He looked at the temperature gauge on the far wall, which read 37 degrees. He looked at the pallets of stacked burlap bags along both long walls, each pallet labeled in Mari's small handwriting with the source cannery, the date received, and the estimated remaining volume. He wrote something on the clipboard. He asked to see the horses. Mari walked him through the barn stall by stall. 12 horses groomed within the last week, hooves picked out that morning, water buckets full and clean. Thaddeus checked the coats. He checked the eyes. He asked to see hoof condition on 3 at random. Mari brought each one out and picked up the requested foot without prompting. Thaddeus wrote more on the clipboard. He asked to see the feed records. Mari brought him to the kitchen table. She opened the ledger to the current calendar year and set it in front of him. She poured coffee into 2 mugs, set one at his elbow, and stepped back to the counter. She did not hover. Thaddeus read for 22 minutes. He turned pages back to 1976. He turned them back to 1974. He read the entries. He read the feed cost calculations. He read the source cannery notations with their contact names and telephone numbers written in the margins. He read the notation in Marie's hand from November of 1976, where she had documented a batch of Crawford County beets that had shown signs of rot on delivery and had been rejected and returned to Everett Landgren the same afternoon rather than fed to the horses. He read her monthly weight tracking on each animal. He looked up. He asked whether he could see the feed prep area. Mari took him to the shop. She showed him the rebuilt washer still in operation, still running on the modified chute she had bent from Raymond's leftover sheet steel 7 years earlier. She showed him the sink where she rinsed the roots before bagging. She showed him the bag storage. She showed him the shelf where she kept the veterinary reference materials, including the County Extension Office's soil survey and the University of Wisconsin's bulletin on winter feeding of horses, both of which she had annotated in her own hand. Thaddeus closed the clipboard. He looked at Mari across the shop floor with an expression that had rearranged itself over the course of the previous 90 minutes from professional caution into something quieter and more attentive. He asked whether she had a few minutes for a conversation that was not part of the official inspection. She did. He was going to write a clean report. There was no basis for the complaint. His office would send her a formal letter to that effect within 30 days. His tone shifted closer now, less procedural. But this complaint is the third one I have personally handled in the past 4 years, involving small horse operations run by women in this region. The first two were also groundless. Someone is filing these complaints for reasons that have nothing to do with animal welfare. I do not have the authority to investigate the source of an anonymous complaint. But I will tell you, Mrs. Thorson, that if you were to file a written statement with our office describing any pattern of harassment you have observed from a specific individual or business, that statement would become part of the file. Any subsequent complaint from a related source would be handled with that context in mind. Mari watched him for a long moment. She was aware, standing in her father's shop, of the weight of the notebook in her coat pocket and of the entries that had accumulated in it over 7 years. Merle Blackwood, Sport Coat, October 1971. Merle Blackwood Co-op, October 1971. Merle Blackwood, Sinclair Station, December 1971. Merle Blackwood, Phone Tree to Onalaska and West Salem, October 1971. And the entries from later. Merle Blackwood, comment overheard at Elton Feed by Alma Jorstad, March of 1973, regarding suspected mismanagement of livestock at the Thorson operation. Merle Blackwood letter to the County Extension Office in July of 1975, questioning the Extension Office's decision to include her operation in a regional survey of alternative horse feeding practices. She had a complete record. She could hand it to Thaddeus Ellsworth and he would attach it to the file. Merle Blackwood would receive a letter from the Department of Agriculture inside a month. He might be interviewed. The cannery might be asked formally to explain the pattern. She thought about it for the length of one long breath her voice measured when it came. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Ellsworth. I am going to decline it. Thaddeus looked at her. She went on. The ledger would settle it. That was what the ledger did. A man who had spent 7 years trying to embarrass her out of business was going to embarrass himself out of business on his own timeline. She did not need to accelerate the process. She needed only to keep her records clean and her deliveries on time. If she filed a statement, Merle Blackwood would tell everyone he knew that the widow at the Mays place had used the state to settle a personal grievance. He would find ways to turn that into a story. She was not interested in becoming the story. She was interested in continuing the work. Thaddeus considered this for a moment. He nodded once. He put the clipboard under his arm. He offered his hand. She took it. He walked back to his car and drove down the drive without stopping at the barn. She stood in the yard until the sound of the state car was gone from the county road. She walked back into the kitchen. She wrote 3 lines in the ledger. Ellsworth inspection, April 12, 1978. Clean report expected. Declined to file counter complaint. Below those lines, she added in the same hand she had used 7 years earlier at the auction. A man watching a clock does not need me to move the hands. The clean report arrived 19 days later. She filed it in a folder in the desk drawer next to the ones for the previous 7 years of state and county correspondence. By 1979, she had 18 horses a waiting list that ran 14 months for foals, and in the last week of March, an unexpected visitor. Dale Kettner drove up her lane on a Wednesday afternoon in a truck that had been washed for the occasion, which was itself an occasion. He parked at the corner of the shop yard rather than the house drive. He got out without slamming the door. He walked over to where Mari was cleaning a bridle on the shop bench and stopped 10 feet away with his hat in his hands. Mari looked up. She waited. She had not spoken to Dale Kettner beyond nodding at church potlucks in the 8 years since the auction. She had watched from a careful distance as he had expanded his operation through the mid-70s on borrowed money, buying 2 additional parcels for a combined 700 acres, taking out operating loans at what the ag lender had told him were manageable rates for the corn prices that had been climbing since 1972. She had watched him buy new equipment. She had watched him build a new machine shed with an insurance settlement from a hail loss. She had not envied any of it. She had more than once sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and done the arithmetic on what his balance sheet must look like, and had felt the specific chill a person feels when they realize a neighbor is walking a beam whose width they can measure and whose length they cannot. Dale spoke first. His voice was flat without any of the bluster of the co-op laughter years before. I need to talk to somebody who is not going to sell me something. My banker is selling me something. My lender is selling me something. The equipment dealer is selling me something. Everett Landgren over in Crawford said if I wanted to talk to somebody who was not going to sell me anything, I should come talk to you. Mari set the bridle down. She wiped her hands on a shop rag. She invited him inside. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Dale had brought a folder of loan documents, an amortization schedule, a projected cash flow that his lender had prepared, and a letter from the bank noting that his interest rate on the operating line would reset in 90 days. Mari read through the folder in silence. She read the amortization schedule twice. She looked at the projected cash flow for a long time. She said very little. When she finally spoke, her tone was careful, the way she would have spoken to a nervous colt. Dale, your projection assumes corn stays above $3 for the next 4 years. And your interest rate assumption on the operating line is that it stays at 7%. Do you have any authority in this document to lock either of those numbers? He did not. She turned the projection sheet over. She took a pencil from the drawer beneath the phone. She wrote 3 columns. She rewrote his projection with corn at 250 and the operating line at 12%. She wrote it in her father's small hand without embellishment. She turned the sheet back around and slid it across the table. Dale looked at the numbers for a long time. He did not argue. He did not protest. He did not tell her that his lender had said such a scenario was extremely unlikely, though his lender had told him exactly that in a meeting the previous Friday. What Dale did was fold the sheet in half and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he sat with his hands on the table and looked out the kitchen window at the ridge for what must have been 3 minutes. Then he spoke softer now without weight. I cannot fix this with the ground I have, can I? Mari looked at him. Her answer came without hesitation and without pity. You can fix part of it. You cannot fix all of it. What you can fix is what you have signed and what you owe. What you cannot fix is what the market is going to do. My father taught me the difference between those two things. I am telling you what he told me, which is that a paid-for farm is the only thing a bank cannot take from you. You have a paid-for farm underneath everything you have borrowed against. If you can protect the home place, you can rebuild. If you lose the home place, you are starting over at 52 with no equipment and no credit. Dale sat with that for a while. When he stood up to leave, he did not shake her hand. He did not thank her in the ordinary way. He said only at the back door with the same flat honesty he had brought in with him, I was one of the ones who laughed at the co-op that morning about the carrots. I want you to know I am not proud of that. I did not come here today because of that. I came here because Everett told me to. But I want you to know. Mari nodded once. She let him leave. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time after his truck had gone down the drive. She did not write anything in the ledger about the visit. Some things did not need to be entered. Some things were part of the private cost of doing business in a small county over a long span of years. The drought came in the summer of 1983. It came late in June and it stayed through August, the ground cracking in the pasture in patterns Marie had never seen before the creek. Down to a trickle by the middle of July, the hay crop cut in half across 3 counties. By the first week of August, hay prices at auction had doubled, and by September they had tripled. Mari's feed costs did not change. She had root vegetables in the cellar. She had root vegetables in the elevator storage in Viroqua, and in supplemental space, she had rented that spring in Sparta. She had root vegetables coming in from Crawford and Monroe, and since 1979 from Richland County as well, where a third cannery had joined her network the year Everett Landgren had recommended her to a colleague. Her horses came through the summer in condition. Her horses came through the fall in condition. When winter arrived in November on the tail of a hard early freeze, her horses were in better shape than the horses at any operation within 50 miles of her farm that was running on hay alone. Her waiting list did not shorten during the drought and the crisis that followed it. It lengthened. She reached 70 months at the peak in the fall of 1984 before she began telling callers she was not accepting new names. She was breeding 6 mares a year. She could not accommodate more without expanding the barn and the pasture, which she was not yet prepared to do. By the end of 1984, the ledger showed a savings balance of $78,000. The farm carried no debt. She had quietly, over the previous 3 years, watched 11 farms in a 12-mile radius of her place go through some version of financial reckoning. 4 had lost ground to the bank. 2 had sold equipment at auction for numbers that did not cover the loans against it. 1 had sold out entirely and moved to Green Bay to work for a paper mill. The Kettner operation had been among the 4 that lost ground. Dale had walked out of the March 1983 conversation at Mari's kitchen table and gone home and refinanced what he could, and sold what he could, and had still lost the 200 acres of East Fields to the bank in a foreclosure that closed in November of 1984. He had held the home place. He had sold most of the equipment. He was farming 300 acres now, with a smaller line of credit and a lender who had learned something about interest rate risk from the previous 4 years. The Vernon County Cannery closed in December of 1984. It was not Mari's doing. The parent company in Milwaukee had made a decision in a boardroom she would never see the inside of cutting 3 underperforming regional canneries in a corporate restructuring that took effect on the first of the year. The closure meant the loss of 42 jobs in Viroqua and the surrounding area. It meant the loss of a market for pea and bean growers across 3 townships. It also meant that Merle Blackwood, at 58, was suddenly out of a job. Mari heard about the closure the same day everyone else did on a Thursday in a 2-column story in the Vernon County Broadcaster. She read the story at the kitchen table with her morning coffee. She did not react. She turned the page. She read the market listings. She read the obituaries as she did every week now that she was of an age when she recognized more of the names than she did not. Merle came looking for her at the co-op on a Friday morning 3 weeks later in the second week of January 1985. Mari was at the counter picking up a case of hoof oil and a length of leather lacing for a bridle repair. Merle came in through the front door and stood for a moment in the vestibule while his eyes adjusted to the dim inside light. When they did, he saw her at the counter and walked over. He was not wearing the wool sport coat. He was wearing an old canvas barn coat that had clearly not been his working coat. He was thinner than he had been. His hair had gone entirely gray in the 2 years since Mari had last seen him at any distance. He stood at her shoulder and waited for her to finish paying. His voice was low, almost formal. "Mrs. Thorson, could I have a word with you?" She nodded. She let Ronnie behind the register hand her the change. She turned to face him. He wanted to know whether she was in the market for a purchasing consultant. He had 34 years in the produce processing industry. He knew every cannery, every renderer, every grower cooperative, from the Wisconsin River to the Mississippi. He could help her formalize her sourcing network. He could help her negotiate contracts. He could help her expand into other regions. Mari looked at him. She was aware of the men around the coffee pot at the back of the store, 3 of whom had been there the morning in October of 1971, when Merle had told the story about the widow buying the crooked carrots. She was aware that they were watching. She was aware that Merle was aware they were watching. And she understood with a clarity that felt to her almost impersonal that Merle had chosen this location for this conversation on purpose, because he wanted a room in which she would be reluctant to say what she was actually thinking. She spoke plainly without lifting her voice. "Mr. Blackwood, I built my sourcing network in 1972. I have been running it for 13 years. I do not need a consultant. What I need is a case of hoof oil, which I have. What you need is not employment. What you need is to stop assuming that a woman who has been watching you for 13 years does not know which 3 anonymous complaints came from your desk between 1975 and 1978. I have known since April of 1978. I chose not to file a countercomplaint at that time. My reasons are my own. But I am telling you now in this store so that you understand where we stand. I do not require an apology. I do not require an explanation. I require only that you never again approach me for professional business of any kind. Do you understand what I am saying to you?" The store was quiet. The men at the coffee pot were not looking away. They were looking directly at the counter now at the 2 figures standing in the yellow light of the overhead bulb. Ronnie behind the register had gone entirely still with the change drawer half open. Merle looked at Mari for what felt to him like a long time. His face had gone through several stages in the span of 30 seconds, from the careful composure he had walked in with to something rawer and more exposed. He nodded once without speaking. He turned. He walked out through the front door of Elton Feed and Supply. The bell over the door rang once behind him. Mari picked up her case of hoof oil. She thanked Ronnie for the change. She walked out to the F-100 and set the case in the bed. She got in and drove home. She did not write about the exchange in the ledger. It did not need to be entered. It had already entered the county on its own. 2 months later, in the second week of March 1985, the Vernon County Broadcaster ran a legal notice in the classifieds. The Kettner East Fields, 200 acres of ridge ground along the north side of Kettner Creek, were to be sold at public auction on the second Tuesday in April, by order of the bank that had foreclosed the previous fall. Terms were cash. Minimum bid was $250 per acre. Mari read the notice on a Wednesday morning at the kitchen table. She read it twice. She folded the paper. She put on her coat and her hat, walked out to the F-100, and drove the 6 miles to the section of the county road that ran along the base of the ridge. She parked on the shoulder. She got out and stood at the fence line for a long time, looking up across the 200 acres she had passed on her way to and from the Crawford County line for the previous 21 years. Good ground, flat enough to work easily. Natural drainage that kept it from ponding in wet springs. Ridge exposure that dried it out early enough in April to plant corn a full week ahead of the low fields. She had studied the ground from this fence line every time she had driven past it since the foreclosure notice in the fall. She stood there for what must have been 20 minutes. The wind was coming off the ridge from the northwest with the specific chill of an early spring afternoon that had not yet decided to warm. Somewhere up above her, a hawk was working the thermals along the ridgeline, riding the updrafts without visible effort. She watched the hawk. She watched the fields. She did the arithmetic in her head one final time, though she had already done it 4 times over the previous 2 weeks at the kitchen table. She walked back to the truck. She drove home. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and made a single entry dated that day in her father's small, precise hand. Eastfield's notice, March 13th, 1985. Auction, April 9th. Minimum $250 per acre. Savings balance, $78,300. Sufficient for a bid up to $400 per acre with a $5,000 reserve. Continue calculation. Below that entry on the next line, she added a single sentence that no one but her would read for another decade, when her niece would find it while going through the ledgers for the first time after Marie's 80th birthday. The ground did not choose the bank. The bank chose the ground. I am going to unchoose it. She closed the notebook. She put it back in the coat pocket. She stood up from the table, walked to the shop, lit the stove, and began the evening's work on a bridle that needed a new billet strap. Outside, past the shop, in the machine shed, and the north pasture where a filly out of Juneau's second colt was learning to accept a halter. For the first time, the light was going down over the ridge in the specific slow way it went down in Vernon County in March, when the days were finally starting to lengthen, and the cold was finally starting in the smallest measurable increments to loosen its hold. 28 days later, she would drive to the Vernon County Fairgrounds in Viroqua with a checkbook in her coat pocket and a bidder's card with the number 7 printed on it in black marker. She would walk into a room she had not entered since she had testified in front of the school board in 1974. She would take a seat 3 rows from the front on the aisle. She would wait. For now, she worked the leather billet strap through the buckle with the small awl and the wax thread, and the patience of a woman who had spent 14 years learning that the difference between a buyer and a builder was not talent. The difference was the willingness to look at what a thing actually was and to do the arithmetic on it, and to keep doing the arithmetic long after everyone else had put their pencils down and gone home to a bank statement they were afraid to open. The bridal was finished by 10 o'clock. She banked the stove for the night. She walked back through the yard to the farmhouse. Above her, in a sky that had gone clear after the afternoon overcast, the stars were coming out over the Vernon County ridges in the slow order they always came out the brightest. First the fainter ones filling in gradually as the eye adjusted to the dark. The Vernon County Fairgrounds sat at the south edge of Viroqua on 12 acres of leveled ground that had once been pasture. The main exhibition hall was a long, low building of painted concrete block with a corrugated metal roof and 8-foot windows along both long walls that let in the flat gray light of an early April afternoon. On the second Tuesday of the month at 1 o'clock, the hall was set with folding chairs in rows of 10 across 12 rows deep. At the front, on a raised platform, stood a lectern, a folding table for the auction clerks, and a chalkboard on which the parcel description had been written in a careful hand. Kettner East Fields, 200 acres more or less. Section 14, Township 12 North Range, 4 West. Minimum bid $250 per acre. Cash terms, bank foreclosure sale. Mari arrived at 12:40. She had driven the F-100 herself, wearing a wool skirt beneath the canvas coat, because a courtroom was not a shop. And this room, though it was not a courtroom, would be closer to one than to any other room she had entered that year. She parked at the far end of the lot next to a chain-link fence that separated the fairgrounds from a field of last year's corn stalks. She walked to the registration table set up outside the hall's east entrance. She gave her name to the woman with the clipboard. She received a bidder's card with the number 7 printed in black marker on a rectangle of white cardstock the size of a paperback book. She walked into the hall. 11 other bidders had registered. Mari counted them as she took her seat 3 rows from the front on the aisle. 2 were neighboring farmers she recognized from co-op mornings and church suppers. Both men in their 50s, both wearing the specific tight expression of men who had survived the previous 4 years by not overextending and who were now cautiously considering whether the bottom had arrived. 3 others were unfamiliar and dressed in a way that told her they were from Madison or Milwaukee. Sport coats, leather portfolios. One had a fountain pen visible in his breast pocket, which was in Vernon County in April of 1985, the equivalent of arriving in a top hat. The remaining 6 were a mix of local men and one woman who ran a nursery operation outside Ontario, all of them looking at the East Fields, the way a person looks at a piece of ground they have been driving past for years without ever expecting the chance to own it. Dale Kettner was in the room. He was standing at the back wall behind the last row of chairs with his hat in his hands. He was not there to bid. He was there because it was his ground, and there were things a man attended in a small county, whether he wished to or not. Mari did not turn around to look at Dale. She had seen him when she came in. He had seen her. They had exchanged the small nod that acknowledged the presence of another person without demanding anything further of the encounter. That was enough. That had been enough between them in various small ways since the March afternoon in 1983, when he had left her kitchen with a folded projection sheet in his shirt pocket. The auctioneer took the platform at exactly 1 o'clock. His name was Otis Rasmussen from a firm out of Sparta that handled bank sales across 4 counties. He was not Wendell Krause. Wendell handled farm dispersals and personal property. Otis handled sales in which no one in the room was smiling. He read the terms of sale from a printed sheet. He read the legal description of the parcel. He confirmed that the bank had clear title that all liens had been discharged and that the successful bidder would be required to tender a certified check or cash for the full amount within 24 hours of the drop of the gavel. He asked whether there were any questions. There were none. He opened the bidding at $250 per acre. The first bid came from one of the neighboring farmers, a man named Alvin Peterson, at $260. The second came immediately from one of the sport coats at $270. The third came from the other neighboring farmer at $280. The fourth from a different sport coat at $290. Mari kept her card in her lap. She was aware without needing to look of the man behind her whose card had not yet come up. She had noted him during registration. He was 52 years old, tall, wearing a charcoal sport coat with a slight sheen to it that suggested it had been chosen for the occasion. His hair was steel gray, cut recently. He wore a wristwatch on a leather band that showed evidence of professional maintenance. His name on the registration sheet was Preston Halverson, representing Midwest Land Holdings out of Madison. He had a leather portfolio open on his lap and a small notebook in which he had already made 3 entries. Preston Halverson had glanced at Mari once when he came into the row. He had noted the canvas coat, the work boots, the hands that had been reddened by early spring cold on the walk-in from the parking lot. He had classified her the way men in his profession classified people, which was quickly and with a small internal category. His category for Mari was local widow present, out of interest or sentiment, not a serious bidder. He had turned his attention to the sport coats in the front rows, whom he understood to be his real competition. He was wrong about this, and he did not know that he was wrong, and he was not going to know it until $350 per acre. The bidding climbed steadily through the 290s and into the low 300s. At 310, Alvin Peterson dropped out. His card went down and did not come back up. At 340, the second neighboring farmer, whose name was Reuben Anderdahl, made a bid he had not planned to make and immediately regretted. At 350, when he was raised, he set his card on the seat beside him and stared at the floor. The woman from Ontario had never lifted her card. 2 of the 6 local men had lifted theirs once and let them fall. That left 3 bidders active. Mari, who had not yet bid, and the 2 sport coats, whose bids were coming in matter-of-factly one after the other, in the manner of men executing a strategy rather than making a decision. At 355, Mari lifted her card for the first time. The auctioneer took the bid and moved on. Otis was too experienced to react to a new bidder appearing at that level. He simply added her number to the pattern. 355 from card 7, 360 from card 3, 365 from card 7, 370 from card 9, 375 from card 7. Preston Halverson turned his head slightly. Not to look at her precisely. He turned it just enough to place her in his peripheral vision. He revised his internal category. She was evidently a serious bidder after all. He made a small adjustment in his notebook. He raised his card. 380. The other sport coat, the one with the fountain pen, held for a beat and then raised. 385. Mari raised. 390. Fountain pen looked at his portfolio for a long moment. He wrote something in the margin of a document he had brought. He closed the portfolio. He set his card face down on his lap. He was out. That left Mari and Preston Halverson. Preston looked at her fully for the first time. He turned in his chair and studied her across the two-row gap that separated them. What he saw was a woman in her mid-40s in a canvas coat and a wool skirt with unfashioned hair pulled back at the nape and a bidder's card held steady in her right hand. She was looking straight ahead at the auctioneer. She was not looking at him. He raised his card. 395. Mari raised 400. The room did the specific thing rooms do when a number is spoken that reorganizes the shape of what everyone in the room has been assuming. It went still. Not silent exactly because the folding chairs creaked and someone in the back coughed and a truck went by on the county road with a load of feed corn that rattled slightly on the turn. But the human sound in the room, the small shifting and murmuring that a crowd makes when it is following a bidding pattern, it understands dropped out. The room was now watching something it did not understand, and it went still while it recalibrated. Preston Halverson paused. It was not a long pause. To Preston, it felt like a series of calculations happening at the speed of arithmetic. 400 an acre was above the ceiling he had been authorized to bid without a phone call back to Madison. 400 was inside his personal discretion by $20 an acre, but only if he was confident the property justified it. He had walked the East Fields the previous Saturday. His firm's valuation model, based on comparable sales in Vernon and Crawford counties over the previous 18 months, had generated a maximum bid of $385. He had been prepared to go to $410 if the bidding was competitive. He was technically still in the range he could justify. But he was now bidding against a local woman in a canvas coat whose bidder card had come up for the first time at $355 and had not hesitated once through 5 raises. He did not know what her ceiling was. He did not know what her information was. He did not know why she wanted the ground. He knew only that a person who bid the way she was bidding either had information he did not have or had a private reason he could not calculate. He looked at his portfolio. He looked at the auctioneer. He looked finally briefly at Mari. Otis Rasmussen began his countdown. 400 once, 400 twice. His hand raised the gavel. Preston Halverson set his card face down on the folding chair beside him. The gavel came down. Otis called the number. Card 7. $400 per acre. 200 acres sold. For the space of about 3 seconds, the room did not react at all. Then a low sound began, not a cheer or an exclamation, but a kind of collective exhaled breath. The sound of 40 people at one time recalculating what had just happened in front of them. Chairs creaked. Someone in the back said something quiet. The 2 clerks at the folding table began writing on a form. Mari stood up. She walked to the front of the hall. She took the pen the clerk offered her. She wrote the check on the desk in a hand that did not shake. $80,000 payable to Farmers and Merchants Bank of Viroqua. She signed her name at the bottom. Maribel A. Thorson. She wrote the date. She handed the check to the clerk. The clerk stamped the sale receipt and gave her a carbon copy. She walked back to her seat. She did not sit down. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair and folded it over her arm. She turned to walk out. Dale Kettner was still at the back wall. He had not moved through the entire bidding sequence. When Mari's eyes met his across the length of the hall, he was already looking at her. He nodded once. It was not a small nod. It was not a large one. It was the nod of a man who had watched a piece of ground go through a proceeding he could not stop, and who was acknowledging that the ground had gone somewhere he could accept. Mari nodded back. That was all. It was enough. It had been the shape of the thing between them since the March afternoon 2 years earlier, and it would be the shape of it for the remaining decades of both their lives. She walked out through the east door of the hall into the parking lot. The wind had shifted to the south during the auction. The afternoon had warmed by 5 or 6 degrees. She was at the F-100 with the door open when a man's voice came from behind her, close enough that she knew he had followed her out. Preston Halverson stood 8 feet from her truck with his portfolio under his arm and his hat in his other hand. He was not angry. He was not defeated. He was more than anything else curious in the specific way a professional is curious when he has been beaten by an approach he does not recognize. His voice was measured level. "Mrs. Thorson, I hope you will forgive the intrusion. I would like to understand who I was bidding against. My firm keeps records of significant regional purchases. It would help me to know what background you are coming from." Mari looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of the $80,000 check receipt in the inside pocket of her coat. She was aware of the ground that was now hers 6 miles from where she stood waiting for spring to arrive in earnest. She reached into the coat pocket. She took out the green notebook. She opened it not to the current page, but to a page dated 14 years earlier. She turned it so that Preston could see the handwriting. Her voice held no edge. It held only the same plainness she had always used with her father's ledger. "This is an entry from October of 1971. Vernon County Fairgrounds. Wendell Krause auction. Holdridge Estate liquidation. Lot 47. Rejected carrots in a broken washer. $60. Sole bidder." Preston looked at the notebook. He did not read the entry all the way through. He did not need to. The date and the number were sufficient. She turned the page. She showed him a later entry dated 1974 for the Holdridge back 6 acres purchased in cash from the estate for $4,200. She turned the page again. She showed him the entries for 2 other parcels bought since then, both in cash, both entered in the same small precise hand. Then she closed the notebook. She looked him in the eye. "You did not know who you were bidding against. That is not a criticism. It is a piece of information. Next time you come into Vernon County to bid, you will know." Preston stood without moving for what was for him an unusually long moment. When he spoke, his tone had shifted, the professional layer stripped away. "May I ask what you plan to do with the ground?" Mari nodded once. "I plan to farm it. I plan to leave it to my niece. She is 9 years old. In another 20 years, she will be old enough to know whether she wants to keep it or sell it. I hope she keeps it. If she does not, that is her decision to make. My job is to make sure the decision belongs to her, and not to a bank in Madison that has decided the timing is favorable." Preston Halverson absorbed this. He did not offer a card. He did not make a professional pitch. He simply nodded, said, "Good afternoon," and walked back toward the hall. Mari watched him go. She put the notebook back in her coat pocket, got in the F-100, started the engine, and drove home to a farmhouse that had been paid for since 1954, in a shop that had been standing since 1946, in 200 additional acres she had over the course of the last 90 minutes added to the estate her father had built, and her husband had died alongside. She stopped once on the drive home. She pulled onto the shoulder of the county road at the base of the ridge that ran along the north side of Kettner Creek. She got out of the truck. She stood at the fence line and looked up across the 200 acres that were now in every legal sense hers. The sun was going down behind her, throwing the ridge into a warm orange light that was already fading toward the cold blue of a Vernon County April evening. Somewhere on the higher ground, a killdeer called twice and then went quiet. She stood there for perhaps 4 minutes. She did not speak. She did not need to. She drove home. She hung the coat on the peg by the back door. She wrote the entry in the ledger at the kitchen table in the same hand and with the same precision she had used for every other significant entry over the previous 18 years. Kettner East Fields, April 9th, 1985. 200 acres at $400 per acre. $80,000. Paid in full at close. Below the entry on the next line, she wrote a single sentence: "The ground came home." Then she closed the notebook, put it in the coat pocket, and went out to the barn to check the mares before dark. The niece was named Meredith. She was the youngest daughter of Mari's younger brother, a man named Ansel Mays, who had left the farm at 18 for the Army in 1963 and had come back 4 years later with a wife from Iowa and a plan to become a rural mail carrier. Ansel and his wife had settled in Sparta 30 miles north of Viroqua and had raised 4 children in a small house on a quarter-acre lot with a pear tree in the backyard. Meredith was born in 1976, the fourth and last of the Mays children. She had been coming to the farm on weekends since she was 3 years old, delivered by her mother on Saturday mornings, and picked up on Sunday afternoons, sometimes staying through school holidays when her parents needed the arrangement. Meredith had come to the farm the way Mari had come to horses, which was to say without being instructed and without needing to be. She had walked into the barn at 4 years old and had stood at the door of Delphine's stall for 20 minutes without moving, watching the old sorrel eat her morning ration. She had asked at 5 whether she could hold a lead rope for a horse that was being led to the pasture. She had asked at 7 whether she could brush a horse's mane. She had asked at 9 whether she could learn to pick a hoof. By the time she was 11 in the summer of 1987, she was helping Mari with morning chores and had, without prompting, begun to notice the small things about horses that only certain people ever noticed. The way a mare stood on the third day of her cycle. The way a foal set her legs when she was about to bolt. The way an older horse carried her head when she was starting to feel a hoof problem before there was any visible sign. Mari watched all of this without commentary. She let Meredith come to her own conclusions. She did not tell Meredith what she was seeing. She let Meredith see it herself. In the summer of 1993, when Meredith was 17, she began spending full summers at the farm. She slept in what had been Mari's childhood bedroom upstairs, under the sloping ceiling on the west side of the farmhouse. She worked from 6 in the morning until 7 in the evening, 6 days a week. She was paid a wage entered in the ledger on the same page format Raymond had used for hired help in 1952. Mari put Meredith to work in the shop before she put her in the barn. This was deliberate. Raymond had put Mari in the ledger before he had put her on a horse. Mari understood why. A person needed to know the cost of things before she could know the value of them. Meredith learned to run the Lincoln welder that summer. She learned to identify the difference between a stress crack and a fatigue crack in a piece of steel. She learned to read the ledger, not just to add the columns, but to read them, which was a different skill. She learned over 3 summers the sourcing network for winter feed. She learned which canneries to call, which produce managers to ask for, by name how to calculate the cost per horse per day for root vegetables versus hay versus commercial supplement, and why the arithmetic consistently favored the sourcing network over every alternative the feed stores could offer. By the summer of 1995, Meredith was 19 years old and had begun keeping her own set of notes in a green composition notebook Mari had bought for her at the hardware store in Viroqua the previous September. Meredith kept her notebook in the tack room on a shelf above the bridle rack next to the veterinary references. She wrote in it in the evenings in a hand that was not yet as small or as precise as Marie's, but was moving in that direction. That was the same summer the Vernon County Agricultural Extension Office scheduled a meeting on alternative income strategies in the post-crisis landscape. The meeting was held on a Thursday evening in June in the basement of the county courthouse. It was open to any farm operator in the county who wished to attend. The Extension Office had asked 3 people to speak. One was an economist from the University of Wisconsin. One was a lender from a regional bank in La Crosse. The third was Maribel Thorson. Mari had not spoken at a public meeting since a school board hearing in the fall of 1974, and she had, when the extension agent called her in April, initially declined. The agent had called back 2 weeks later and had asked her again and had said something that changed her mind. He had said that there were people in the county who would benefit from hearing the arithmetic explained in plain language by someone who had done it rather than by someone who had studied it. Mari had thought about this for a full day. She had called the agent back and had said yes. The basement of the courthouse held about 70 people that evening. Mari sat in the front row with the other 2 speakers. She was 55 years old. She wore a blue cotton dress under the canvas coat, which she took off and folded across her lap when she sat down. Meredith was in the audience in the 3rd row on the aisle in the seat directly behind Francis Oberlin, who had driven down from Cedar Bluff with a covered dish for the potluck that would follow. The economist spoke first for 20 minutes with charts. The lender spoke second for 15 minutes without charts, which was in his favor. Then the agent introduced Mari. She walked to the microphone with a notebook in her hand. She did not open it. She did not need to. Her voice carried across the basement, without effort, plain as the first frost. I started with a farm that was paid for a ledger my father taught me to keep, and $60 I spent at an auction in 1971. Everything I have built since then, I built on the arithmetic of not owing anyone anything. She paused. The room was quiet. She went on. The farm crisis, she told them, had not been caused by bad farming. The men and women who had lost operations in this county between 1981 and 1985 had not been bad farmers. They had been farmers who borrowed operating money at rates that were presented to them as stable, and the rates had turned out not to be stable. The only defense against a rate that could change was an operation that did not depend on the rate staying where it was. That was not a moral judgment on borrowing. That was arithmetic. She had fed her horses rejected carrots for 24 years because the carrots were nutritionally equivalent to what the feed store sold and cost her a fraction of the price. She said the difference between those two prices compounded over 24 years was the Kettner East Fields. She said that plainly without ornament, and she did not turn her head to see whether Dale Kettner was in the room, though she knew he was because she had seen him come in. She said she did not think she was smarter than anyone in the room. She said she thought she had been lucky to have a father who kept a ledger and taught her to read it. She said the ledger did not tell a person what to do. The ledger only told the truth about what a person had already done. What a person did with that truth was up to them. She sat down. The room did not applaud right away. It applauded after a beat in the delayed way rural rooms applauded when they had been given something to think about that they had not been expecting. The economist looked at her once with an expression Mari could not read. The lender looked at his hands. Francis Oberlin found Marie in the parking lot after the meeting broke up. Francis had been buying Mari's surplus root vegetables for 24 years by then. She had been standing at the tailgate of Mari's F-100 for about a minute when Mari came out with a paper plate of leftover potato salad from the potluck. Her voice carried the same steady warmth Mari remembered from Cedar Bluff. I have been telling that carrot story to every horse person I know for 24 years. What I have never told them because it did not seem like the point of the story is what I actually appreciate about you. It is not the price. It is the consistency of the delivery schedule. In 24 years, you have not missed a delivery. Not once. Mari looked at Francis across the tailgate, her answer simple and direct. That is the same thing, Francis. It is all the same thing. Francis considered this. She nodded slowly. She did not press further. They stood at the tailgate for a few more minutes without speaking. The June evening was warm. Fireflies had begun to appear at the edge of the parking lot where the mown grass met the hedgerow. Somewhere on the road, a truck went by, hauling a stock trailer with 2 horses inside. Mari could tell from the sound of the trailer springs how much weight was in it. She had learned that sound over 22 years of driving her own trailers and standing beside other people's. Frances got into her car. Mari drove home. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and did not open the ledger. Some evenings did not require entries. Meredith took over primary management of the horse operation in 1998. She was 22. She had come home to the farm the previous September after 4 years at UW River Falls, where she had studied animal science with a minor in agricultural economics. She had told Mari before she left for college that she intended to come back. Mari had not pressured her to make that promise and had told her explicitly that she was not obligated to keep it. Meredith had come back anyway on her own timeline with her own reasons. She kept the ledger in the same green composition notebooks Mari had used, bought 3 at a time from the hardware store in Viroqua, because that was where Raymond had bought his, and it was where Mari had bought hers, and Meredith saw no reason to change a system that had worked for 50 years. The root washer Mari had rebuilt in 1971 was still in the corner of the shop. It had washed carrots and beets and turnips and rutabagas every fall for 27 consecutive seasons. Meredith washed with it now. She had watched Mari change the brush rollers twice in 1984 and in 1993. She had changed them herself with a new stock they had brought back from the same farm supply in La Crosse in the fall of 1998. The sourcing network was still running. Everett Landgren had retired in 1991, and his successor at the Crawford County Cannery had continued the arrangement without any change in the terms. The Monroe County contact had changed hands 3 times, and the current purchasing manager had kept Mari's number in the same Rolodex his predecessors had kept it in. Richland County had joined in 1979 and had never left. 2 more counties had joined in the early 1990s. The waiting list for foals was 14 months at the beginning of 1998 and would remain between 8 and 16 months for every year. Meredith would run the operation for the next several decades. The farm carried no debt. It never had in Mari's stewardship. It never would in Meredith's. The shop still stood behind the farmhouse. The workbench Raymond had built in 1948 was still under the south wall. The Lincoln welder was still on the shelf. The coffee can of welding rod was still where Mari had left it. The rebuilt root washer was still in the corner. The wood stove in the northwest corner was still the one Raymond had installed in 1946, though it had been rebuilt with new fire brick twice, and its stovepipe had been replaced once. The tin roof had been replaced entirely in 1991. The concrete floor was original. Mari lived until 2014. She was 74 when she died in the front bedroom of the farmhouse where she had been born of a cardiac event that took her in the night without pain and without warning. Meredith found her the next morning when she came in to start the coffee. Mari was in bed with the covers pulled to her shoulders and her hands folded on top of the quilt. Her reading glasses were on the nightstand next to a green composition notebook. The notebook was open to a page dated the previous evening. On that page, in the small, precise hand her father had taught her 65 years earlier, she had written the day's feed cost per horse, the projected foaling schedule for the following spring, and the current savings balance. Below those entries on the last line she would ever write in any ledger she had noted the weather. Clear 42 degrees wind southwest at 8 first robins observed in the yard. Meredith kept that notebook. She did not put it away with the others. She kept it on the shelf above her own working desk in the kitchen, where she could see it every day. At the time of Mari's death, the operation ran on 682 acres. Most of it paid for by Marie, and the rest paid for by Meredith in 3 additional purchases she had made in the year since 1998. There were 28 horses in the barn and the pastures. The waiting list for foals was 11 months. The savings balance entered in the last legible line of Mari's hand was $164,000, which was every dollar the operation had earned that had not been reinvested in ground or in equipment. The green composition notebooks accumulated on a shelf in the kitchen in chronological order from 1932 through 2014. The oldest ones were Raymond's. The middle ones were Mari's. The newest ones were now Meredith's. They were when a person read them in order the arithmetic of 3 generations of one family that had held its ground in a small county in southwestern Wisconsin for more than 80 years, largely because none of them had ever borrowed against the ground to pay for something they wanted more than they wanted the ground. The auction receipt from 1985 folded in half was kept between the pages of the 1985 ledger in the entry Marie had written the evening of April 9th. Meredith had found it there the first time she read the ledger straight through in the summer she was 15. She had read the entry twice. She had read the sentence Marie had written underneath the entry. She had folded the receipt back into the notebook. She had not mentioned finding it. She did not need to. On the last day of her life, Marie had walked out to the shop as she had done every morning of every day since 1971, except for the mornings when she was in the hospital in 1988 for gallbladder surgery, and she had lit the stove, and she had sat on the milking stool in front of the root washer for perhaps 3 minutes without doing anything, which was a thing she had begun to do more often in the last several years of her life. She had looked at the washer. She had looked at the shop that her father had built, and the tools he had accumulated, and the ones she had added over the decades she had run the operation. Then she had gotten up, walked back to the house, made coffee, and started the day. The county changed around the farm over the years. The Vernon County Cannery closed since 1984 had been demolished in 1996. The lot on which it had stood became a strip mall by 2001. Merle Blackwood had left the county in 1986, moved to Green Bay to live with a sister, and had died there in 1998 at the age of 71. Marie had read his obituary in the Vernon County Broadcaster the week after his funeral. She had folded the paper without commentary and had thrown it in the wood stove that evening along with the day's other kindling. Dale Kettner had died in 2004 at 73 on the home place he had held on to in the crisis, and Marie had gone to his funeral in the little Lutheran church outside Viroqua, and she had sat 3 pews back and had spoken to no one afterward except Dale's widow, to whom she had offered a specific and quiet condolence that was accepted with a nod and a hand on her arm and nothing more. Preston Halverson wrote to Marie once in the fall of 1985, 6 months after the Eastfield sale. It was a short letter on the letterhead of Midwest Land Holdings. He wrote to thank her for her time in the parking lot that afternoon. He wrote that the conversation had changed the way his firm approached bidding in rural counties and that he had shared what he had learned from her with several of his colleagues. He said he did not expect to bid against her again in Vernon County, but that if he ever did, he wished her the best of it in advance. Marie read the letter twice. She wrote a brief reply thanking him for his note and wishing him well in return. She filed his letter and a carbon of hers in the folder labeled 1985. That was the last time either of them ever wrote to the other. The waiting list continued, the sourcing network continued, the green notebooks continued. The shop continued to stand with the same tools on the same bench and the same wood stove in the same corner, and the same rebuilt washer that had more than any other single object on the farm come to represent for Meredith the simple and hard-earned fact that a thing thrown away by one system might turn out to be in the hands of the right person, the foundation of something the throwing away had never imagined. On the evening of the second Tuesday in April in 2014, 1 week to the day after Marie's funeral, Meredith walked out to the shop after supper. She lit the stove. She sat on the milking stool in front of the washer. She sat there for perhaps 20 minutes without doing anything. Then she got up, walked back to the house, opened the current notebook on the kitchen table, and wrote the day's entries in a hand that had become, over the previous 2 decades, smaller and more precise than she would have believed possible when she started. Below the day's entries on the next line, she wrote a single sentence: "The ground is still home." She closed the notebook. She banked the fire in the wood stove for the night. She went upstairs to the bedroom that had been Mari's, and before that Alma's, and before that the room in which Raymond had died in the winter of 1967. And she went to sleep in the specific quiet of a farmhouse that had been paid for since 1954, and a shop that had been standing since 1946, and a piece of ground that had never once in any generation been mortgaged to pay for anything other than more of itself. Outside past the shop, in the machine shed in the north pasture, where a filly out of the current led mare was learning to accept a halter. For the first time, the light had gone down over the Vernon County ridge, in the specific slow way it went down in April, and the stars had come out over the fields, in the order they always came out, and the wind had shifted in the small hours after midnight to the south.